The thrum of Chicago's relentless energy seemed to seep through the steel and glass of the Silver Oak Insurance Tower. Yet within the beige-carpeted confines of the 32nd floor, the only discernible rhythm was the sterile click-clack of keyboards and the hushed murmur of 100 carefully modulated voices. I, Claire Ashton, was a senior claims processor, a title that sounded far more important than it felt. My days were a blur of digital files and scanned documents, each one representing a life interrupted, a body ailing, a family teetering on the brink of financial or emotional collapse. My task was to dissect these narratives of human vulnerability through the cold, unyielding lens of policy language, deciding who received the lifeline Silver Oak offered and who did not. I'd started in this field with a naive sort of idealism, a belief that I could genuinely make a difference. 8 years in, that idealism was weathered, replaced by a pragmatic, often weary, determination to simply be fair. But fairness, I was learning, was a subjective concept in the corporate world, easily bent by bottom lines and unspoken agendas. The work, despite its purported aim to help, often felt like wielding a scalpel without anesthetic, precise, necessary, but chillingly detached. You built emotional calluses, layer by layer, just to survive the daily onslaught of despair and bureaucracy. Then, on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind where the sky outside mirrored the muted tones of my cubicle, the file of Monica Reyes appeared in my queue. A single mother, her ethnicity noted as Latina, a detail that shouldn't matter, but often, subtly, did in the undercurrents of systemic bias. Her son, 8-year-old Mateo, was battling acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a monster of a diagnosis. The immediate issue was a request for an extension of his chemotherapy coverage. He'd completed the initial 6-month approved cycle, and now the automated system, with its heart of silicon and algorithms, had spat out a denial. Maximum periodic support limit reached. Standard, by the book. My cursor hovered over the deny button. It would take 2 seconds, but I hesitated. Something about the clinical summary of Mateo's condition, the hopeful yet desperate tone in Monica's attached letter, snagged at a thread of the idealism I thought long buried. I opened Mateo's medical charts, the doctor's progress notes, the pathology reports. His prognosis was guarded but not hopeless. Continued treatment was critical. I dug deeper into Silver Oak's master policy document, a digital tome so vast and convoluted it made War and Peace look like a pamphlet. Hours passed. My lunch sat uneaten, a cold sandwich mocking my preoccupation. And then I found it. Buried in an addendum to an ancillary benefits rider, a clause so obscure I doubted more than a handful of people in the entire corporation even knew it existed. It was a discretionary provision, allowing for extended coverage under extraordinary compassionate circumstances, contingent upon a detailed justification and a senior manager's override. It was a long shot, a bureaucratic Everest to climb, but it was there. Monica Reyes didn't fit the standard template, but this clause, this tiny forgotten loophole, could be Mateo's lifeline. Armed with highlighted printouts and a carefully prepared summary, I headed for the office of Roger Kane, the branch director. Kane was a man sculpted from ambition and indifference. His office, all dark wood and power ties, felt like a different climate zone from the bustling bullpen where the real work happened. He listened with a veneer of patience, his fingers steepled, his eyes betraying nothing but a bored sort of appraisal. He skimmed my notes, his lips pursed. "Ms. Ashton," he began, his voice smooth as polished ice, "this is commendable diligence. However, Mrs. Reyes is a single parent. Statistically, there's a higher probability of inconsistent premium payments. We can't let sentimentality dictate fiscal responsibility. Our primary duty is to our shareholders, not to engage in acts of charity. He pushed the file back across the vast expanse of his desk. Process the denial. We have protocols for a reason. The calluses I'd so carefully cultivated over the years suddenly felt paper-thin. A spark of defiance, hot and unexpected, flared within me. "Mr. Kane," I said, my voice low but steady, "we are a health insurance company. We sell policies that promise care and support in times of crisis. If we strip the humanity from that promise, if we ignore the compassionate circumstances our own policies allow for, then what exactly are we selling? False hope? Because that feels less like insurance and more like a predatory loan consolidation scheme." A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed his features before the mask of managerial detachment snapped back into place. "That will be all, Ms. Ashton. Adhere to standard procedure." I walked out of his office, Monica's file clutched in my hand, the weight of it suddenly immense. The air in the hallway felt thick with unspoken warnings. The retribution was swift and surgically precise. The next morning, an email from Human Resources, curt and impersonal, summoned me to a brief procedural review. The HR manager, a woman whose smile never seemed to engage her eyes, read from a script. "Claire Ashton, your actions in circumventing established approval hierarchies regarding the Reyes claim, specifically by directly approaching senior management with a pre-decided case, constitute a breach of internal workflow protocols." There was no room for explanation, no opportunity to defend my interpretation of the policy. It was an indictment, not a discussion. The consequence was a reassignment to optimize departmental efficiencies. In plainer terms, I was demoted, shunted from senior claims, with its complex high-value cases and access to strategic discussions, to the churning anonymous pool of Tier 1 processors. My security clearance for certain databases was revoked. My name vanished from mailing lists for departmental strategy meetings. It was a clear, unequivocal message. Stay in your lane or be erased. The social climate of the office shifted as if a cold front had blown through. Colleagues who'd once shared lunchtime gossip or sought my advice on tricky files now offered fleeting, uncomfortable glances or suddenly found themselves engrossed in their computer screens when I passed. The isolation was a tangible thing, a suffocating blanket. One evening, a text message blinked onto my phone. It was from Mark, a fellow senior adjuster, a man I'd considered a friend. "Claire, word from the top is that Kane is gunning for you. He's making an example. Watch your back. This place is turning toxic." Fear wasn't the dominant emotion. It was a profound, aching disillusionment. This wasn't just about my career trajectory. It was about the soul of the company, or what little of it remained. A fortnight later, the call I'd been dreading came. Monica Reyes. Her voice was fragile, broken. "Ms. Ashton, Claire, they stopped Mateo's treatment this morning," she stammered, words catching on sobs. "The hospital said the insurance wouldn't cover it anymore. We have to bring him home. I don't know what to do. I don't know." She wasn't accusatory, only lost. "I don't blame you, Chi," she added, using the respectful Vietnamese term for an older sister that I knew from her file was part of her cultural heritage, a small, heartbreaking detail. "You tried, but where do I go from here?" I listened, the silence on my end of the line heavy with impotence. What could I say? That the system was rigged? That my boss was a callous monster? That I had failed her? "Monica," I finally managed, my own voice thick, "I am so sorry," but apologies were hollow currency. As I hung up, the image of Mateo, small and frail, and Monica, fighting a battle on too many fronts, burned into my mind. The disillusionment began to smolder, then to ignite into a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't over. If Kane wanted to make an example of me, he had no idea what kind of example I was about to become. My new role in the Tier 1 processing pool was drudgery, a mind-numbing assembly line of simple claims and data entry. But it also offered an unexpected vantage point. I was now swimming in the shallow end of the data pool, handling the sheer volume of everyday transactions, the small, seemingly insignificant adjustments, the routine payment authorizations, the minor claim denials. And it was in this deluge of the mundane that I began to see the subtle eddies, the almost imperceptible currents that hinted at something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. It started with a flicker of déjà vu. A denied claim for a straightforward procedure, let's say a physiotherapy session for a sprained ankle, would reappear a week later, not as an appeal, but as a freshly processed claim, often with a slightly altered service code or a different referring physician. The curious part? The payout value would be significantly higher, and the beneficiary name, while similar, would be routed to a different payment address, often a P.O. box or a newly established corporate entity I didn't recognize. Then there were the phantom adjustments. Files marked for archival or deletion due to policy ineligibility would briefly vanish from the active system, only to resurface moments later, their status miraculously changed to approved for expedited payment. These payments were often channeled through an obscure internal ledger, coded as the Special Disbursements Fund or Priority Vendor Services, accounts that had no clear public documentation or oversight committee listed in any of Silver Oak's internal compliance manuals. It was all too neat, too clean, too invisible. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. This wasn't just sloppy record-keeping. This felt deliberate. My evenings transformed. My small apartment became a clandestine operations center. Fueled by black coffee and a growing sense of outrage, I began my own quiet investigation. I taught myself to navigate the arcane back alleys of Silver Oak's archived databases, using my old, unrevoked credentials for sections of the system most Tier 1 processors never touched. I cross-referenced claim numbers, patient IDs, physician codes, and payment destinations. I meticulously documented every anomaly, every suspicious transaction, creating spreadsheets that mapped out a complex web of interconnected data points. I learned about shell corporations and IP address masking. The digital breadcrumbs were faint, but they were there. Slowly, like a developing photograph in a darkroom, a horrifying picture began to materialize. Roger Kane, it appeared, wasn't just a ruthless manager obsessed with the bottom line. He was, I suspected, at the heart of a sophisticated, systematic fraud. He had allegedly created a parasitic ecosystem within Silver Oak, a shadow operation that fed off the legitimate suffering of denied policy holders. He would take these rejected claims, people like Monica Reyes, deemed unworthy of the company's resources, and resurrect them. The renewed, often inflated claims would then be processed, but the substantial payouts weren't going to the original desperate claimants. Instead, they were allegedly being diverted through a labyrinth of shell companies and intermediary service providers. Entities that, with a bit more digging, I found were often registered to his relatives or close associates. He was, in essence, laundering denied benefits, transforming legitimate despair into his personal slush fund. The sheer audacity of it, the cold-blooded cynicism, left me breathless. He wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing hope, betraying the very core principle of insurance. And he was doing it under the noses of everyone, protected by layers of bureaucracy and plausible deniability. The knowledge was a dangerous weight. I knew I couldn't confront Kane directly, nor could I risk confiding in anyone within the Chicago branch. He had eyes and ears everywhere, and any premature move, any uncorroborated accusation, would see me not just fired, but potentially facing legal repercussions for slander or misuse of company data. I would be dismissed as a disgruntled, paranoid ex-employee, my credibility shredded. No, if I was going to expose this, I needed irrefutable proof, a case so airtight it would detonate on impact. My life bifurcated. By day, I was Claire Ashton, the demoted Tier 1 processor, efficiently clicking through my quota of mundane claims. My demeanor carefully neutral, almost defeated. By night, I was a forensic investigator, a digital ghost haunting Silver Oak's systems. I became meticulous, almost obsessively cautious. I installed screen capture software on my personal laptop that silently logged every action, every file accessed, every suspicious email I managed to view in the archives. I knew company IT could monitor network traffic, so I focused on data that was already downloaded or accessible through less monitored legacy systems. I found an old, forgotten flatbed scanner in a dusty supply closet on a lower floor, a relic from a pre-digital age. Late one evening, when the building was mostly empty, I began the painstaking process of scanning problematic physical files that corresponded to the digital anomalies I'd found. Claims that had been marked for shredding but still lingered in out-of-the-way filing cabinets. These were the ghosts in the machine, tangible evidence of transactions that officially no longer existed. Each piece of evidence was meticulously cataloged on an encrypted USB drive, never connected to the Silver Oak network, stored in a fireproof safe I'd bought for cash. I created complex Excel spreadsheets, cross-referencing claim ID numbers, dates of service, initial denial reasons, subsequent reactivation codes, payout amounts, and the names and registration details of the recipient shell corporations. The patterns became undeniable, a constellation of fraud shining brightly in the dark data. 3 months. 3 months of living a double life, fueled by adrenaline and a righteous fury that burned away any fear. 3 months of existing on minimal sleep, of conversations replayed in my head, of constant vigilance. By the end of it, I had a dossier that would make a seasoned prosecutor weep with joy. It contained detailed records of 42 separate claims that had been fraudulently manipulated. Each one represented a real person, a real illness, a real denial that had been twisted for Kane's profit. Tracing information for 6 primary shell corporations, complete with their bogus addresses, often mail drops, and the names of their directors, names that, with a little more digging through public records, I linked back to Kane's brother-in-law and a former college roommate. Copies of internal fund transfer authorizations bearing Kane's digital signature, moving substantial sums into these vendor accounts for consulting services or expedited processing fees that were never rendered. And the crown jewel, a partially recovered deleted email. It was from Kane's personal account, sent to an external address I eventually traced to his brother-in-law, identified only by the initials BR. The subject line was innocuous, quarterly reconciliation, but the body, though brief, was damning. Accelerate Q3 withdrawals and scrub the linked profiles. Keep Claire Ashton's access restricted to Tier 1 tasks only. The less she sees, the better. It was the smoking gun. His paranoia about me, the very actions he took to sideline me, had inadvertently provided the final piece of the puzzle. I made 2 identical copies of the entire dossier. One, compiled into a formal complaint with supporting evidence, was prepared for the Illinois State Financial Crimes Task Force. The other, focusing on internal corporate governance violations and fiduciary irresponsibility, was addressed to the Chief Legal Officer and the Board of Directors at Silver Oak Insurance's corporate headquarters in New York. I sent them both via registered express courier, with return receipts requested from a post office miles away from my apartment or workplace. Then, I waited. It was the hardest part of all. Knowing what I knew, having set these wheels in motion, and then having to return to my mundane Tier 1 tasks, feigning ignorance, every nerve ending screaming. The 6 weeks that followed the dispatch of my dossiers were a masterclass in forced composure. Each morning, I walked into the Silver Oak office, my expression carefully neutral, my interactions brief and professional. I processed my Tier 1 claims with robotic efficiency, acutely aware of the digital clock on my monitor ticking down the minutes, each one a small eternity. The silence from both the Illinois State Financial Crimes Task Force and Silver Oak's New York headquarters was deafening. Doubts gnawed at the edges of my resolve. Had the packages been intercepted, dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled employee? Was Kane, with his network of influence, somehow untouchable? Sleep was a luxury, often interrupted by jolts of anxiety or vivid replays of potential confrontations. Then, on a blustery Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the Chicago wind howled a mournful song around the skyscrapers, the dam finally broke. I wasn't in the main bullpen that day. I had, with what I hoped appeared as casual foresight, requested a day of personal leave, citing a vague, minor dental procedure. In reality, I was sitting in a small coffee shop several blocks away, nursing a lukewarm latte. My phone clutched in a clammy hand, pretending to read a book while my senses were on high alert. The first text came from Sarah, the junior adjuster who had warned me months ago. "OMG, Claire! You will not believe this! FBI! They're all over the 35th floor. CAINS office." My heart hammered against my ribs. A wave of mingled terror and vindication washed over me. More texts flooded in, a chaotic stream of eyewitness accounts from bewildered colleagues. "They're leading Kane out, in handcuffs." "Whole exec wing is locked down." "What is happening?" Roger Kane, the architect of so much quiet devastation, the man who moved with such untouchable arrogance, was being arrested. In his own glass-walled office, in full view of the senior management team he so carefully cultivated and manipulated. The image was potent, a public dismantling of a private empire built on deceit. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for months. It wasn't triumph I felt, not exactly. It was a profound, weary relief and a sliver of grim satisfaction. The next day, my phone buzzed with a different kind of summons. An official-looking email from Silver Oak Corporate, New York. Not HR this time. This was from the executive suite. I was requested, not ordered, requested, to present myself at the main headquarters for a confidential discussion regarding recent events at the Chicago branch. The flight to New York was surreal. I, Claire Ashton, the recently demoted claims processor, was being flown first class to meet with the titans of Silver Oak. The irony wasn't lost on me. The 18th floor of the New York skyscraper was another world entirely from the functional beige of the Chicago branch. Here, it was hushed tones, original artwork, and panoramic views of the city that never sleeps. The air thrummed with a power so palpable it was almost a physical presence. I was escorted into a large, elegantly appointed conference room. Seated at the far end of a long, polished table was a woman who exuded an aura of quiet authority and penetrating intelligence. This was Ellen Dorsey, Executive Vice President of Global Human Resources for Silver Oak Insurance. Not just branch HR, but the very top of the entire corporate HR structure. She gestured for me to sit, her gaze direct but not unkind. There were no preliminaries, no attempts to pry information. "Ms. Ashton," she began, her voice calm and measured, "we received your comprehensive report, as did the authorities in Illinois. Let me be clear. We know you are the whistleblower." She held up a hand. "No confirmation is necessary. What I want to convey, on behalf of the board and the executive leadership, is our appreciation, not just for the information, which was critical, but for the manner in which you gathered and presented it. It was professional, meticulously documented, and strategically sound. You operated with a level of discretion and precision that, frankly, entire teams in our legal and compliance department strive for and don't always achieve. I simply nodded, unsure what to say. Years of keeping my head down, of being the quiet, diligent worker, hadn't prepared me for this kind of direct, high-level acknowledgement. Silver Oak has been deeply damaged by Mr. Kane's actions, Dorsey continued, her expression serious. Financially, yes, but more importantly, reputationally and culturally. We have a cancer that needs to be excised, and the healing process will be long and challenging. We need leaders who embody integrity, courage, and a genuine commitment to ethical practice. She paused, her eyes searching mine. We want you to spearhead that change in the Midwest, Claire. We are offering you the position of Regional Director of Human Resources for the entire Midwest territory. My breath caught, from demoted processor to Regional HR Director. It was a dizzying leap. Silver Oak needs to be rebuilt, she said, a hint of steel in her voice. And that rebuilding starts with its people, with its character. We believe you are the person to help us do that. Walking back into the Chicago branch a week later, armed not with claim files but with a mandate for change, was one of the strangest experiences of my life. The whispers that followed me down the hallways were no longer speculative or pitying. They were a mixture of awe, curiosity, and perhaps a little fear. I was no longer just Claire Ashton, the quiet woman from claims. I was the catalyst, the one who had dared to pull back the curtain. My new office was on the executive floor, ironically, just down the hall from Kane's now sealed former domain. The view was better, but the responsibility was immense. Ellen Dorsey and the New York leadership had given me significant autonomy, a clear signal that they were serious about reform. My first priority was to implement robust whistleblower protections. No one else should have to go through the silent, isolating hell I had endured. We established anonymous reporting channels, independent investigative protocols, and ironclad guarantees against retaliation. It wasn't just policy. It was about fostering a culture where speaking up was seen as an act of loyalty, not betrayal. Next, I initiated a full review of all denied and suspiciously processed claims from the past 3 years, focusing particularly on those involving vulnerable individuals or unusual payment diversions. This was a monumental task, requiring coordination with forensic accountants and legal teams, but it was non-negotiable. Justice needed to be retroactive where possible. We organized mandatory company-wide workshops on ethical conduct and professional responsibility. These weren't the usual dry check-the-box compliance sessions. I brought in external ethicists, facilitated open discussions about real-world dilemmas, and made it clear that ethical lapses, at any level, would have serious consequences. I wanted employees to understand that doing the right thing wasn't just a platitude, it was a core operational principle. I worked closely with the legal and IT departments to implement enhanced oversight of financial data streams and claim processing pathways. We needed transparent systems with multiple checkpoints, making it exponentially harder for anyone to manipulate claims or divert funds unnoticed. The Special Provisional Fund and other such opaque channels were dismantled entirely. Amidst the whirlwind of strategic planning, policy drafting, and endless meetings, there was one call I knew I had to make personally. Monica Reyes. Finding her new contact information took some doing. She had moved after losing her previous apartment due to financial strain. When I finally reached her, her voice was hesitant, wary. Monica, this is Claire Ashton, from Silver Oak Insurance? There was a long pause. I remember you, she said softly. I took a deep breath. Monica, a lot has changed at Silver Oak. We've been reviewing past cases and, well, thanks to a new initiative, the Back and Care Financial Assistance Program, we've reopened Mateo's file. His continued treatment will be fully covered, and we're arranging for retroactive compensation for the period he was without coverage and for related out-of-pocket expenses you incurred. The silence on the other end was broken by a small, choked sound. Then, a sob. And another. Are you serious? She whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Mateo, he can get his medicine again? Yes, Monica, he can. I explained the new program, a direct result of the reforms, designed to provide a safety net for cases like hers. It was a program I had personally championed and pushed through. I knew it, she said, her voice trembling but stronger now. I knew there was someone good there. Even when everything felt so dark, I remembered you trying to help. Bien la chi? She repeated, that small phrase carrying so much weight. I knew someone still thought of us. Hearing her words, the raw gratitude and relief in her voice was more rewarding than any promotion, any accolade. It was the affirmation that the fight, the risk, the lonely nights spent hunting for truth in a sea of data, it had all been worth it. The system wasn't perfect, and the work of rebuilding trust would take years. But for Monica, for Mateo, and for countless others whose names I didn't yet know, a measure of justice had been served, and a path toward healing had begun. Silver Oak still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope that we were finally heading in the right direction. My own journey had been unexpected, a descent into the murky underbelly of corporate greed, followed by an ascent into a role I never imagined. But as I looked out over the Chicago skyline from my new office, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't just be a placeholder. I would be a guardian, a voice for those who had none, ensuring that the promise of care at Silver Oak was more than just a word in a policy document. It would be a commitment etched in integrity and action.